Hello, American literature students. This video is about the literature that we're going to be reading in the second week of class. We're going to continue to look at literature of the late 1800s, and we're looking at two relatives of realism, psychological realism and naturalism. You might have noticed at the front of the reading guide this week is some space for you to take notes on this, kind of a loose outline, so go ahead and grab that. Okay, so quickly let's review realism. You know from last week that the key word in realism is ordinary. These authors tended to write about ordinary things, ordinary plots, ordinary settings, characters using ordinary language, dialect, ordinary characters, and often the plots featured the complex ethical choices that these characters would make. So, for example, Sylvie has to decide whether to report to the hunter about the whereabouts of the white heron, or Huck has to wrangle with the decision to turn in Jim or to keep hiding his whereabouts. This literature also typically had a didactic purpose. It was meant to instruct and to teach a lesson. So keep all of these things in mind as we continue to read this week, because basically we're going to still see these same things with a couple of twists here. So if we look at a definition of realism that I really like by the author William Dean Howells, he described it as fidelity to experience and probability of motive. When we look at psychological realism, we're going to be focusing on this probability of motive part. The idea that people are going to act in ways that we might expect is sort of one way to look at it. So, psychological realism. You can probably predict, based on the title, a little bit about what it's going to emphasize. As our book says, the Norton, it emphasizes the interior, moral, and psychological lives of the characters. There's also emphasis on the characters' thought processes, motivations, and consciousness. So there's a lot of emphasis, in other words, on what's going on inside characters' minds, how they think, what they're thinking about. Let's look at the title of the novella, the short novel we'll be reading this week, Daisy Miller, A Study. Let's look at that second part. The title itself would suggest that Daisy Miller is the main character, right? But what about that second part, a study? Who is studying her? Think about who the main character might be. How do we know what we know about Daisy in this study that we're reading? I want you to think about that. All the information that we're getting about her, where is it coming from? And can we trust it? And then when you read the yellow wallpaper, I want you to think about what's happening to the narrator in her mind. How can you tell? And at what point can you tell? Okay. Finally, on psychological realism, I wanted to give you a definition I like by Dr. Kip Wheeler, another literature professor, who emphasizes the character's interiority, their complex emotional and intellectual depth, including perhaps subconscious urges and fears that they're not even aware of. Okay. He goes on to describe how the characters react to external characters and situations in a manner consistent with the expectations of readers. In other words, realistically. Key figures, Henry James is sort of the granddaddy of psychological realism, in much the same way that we might say Mark Twain is the granddaddy of realism in general. Perkins Gilman, and Edith Wharton are also some big names, although the latter two didn't necessarily write psychological realism for their entire careers. They are both associated with the movement. Okay, so let's move on to naturalism. The other short texts you'll be reading this week are naturalistic texts. I know based on the term alone that it looks like this is literature about nature, but it's not really quite so simple. It's a little more complex than that. So let's talk about naturalism. Scholars debate, as our textbook says on page 10, whether this is a relative of realism, a subset of some sort, or something else completely. I prefer to look at it as a type of realism that steps up a few things in a few different ways. So we'll look at that more specifically. One way to think about naturalism is realism plus Darwin. I want you to think about the influence Darwin would have had on the way that people thought about why they are who they are. Darwin, of course, emphasized evolution and the effects of the environment on evolution. So the naturalists of the 90s, the 1890s, keep that date in mind, reflected in their novels their age's increasing sense of limitations imposed upon man by his biological past and his social present. That's Donald Pizer, a scholar of the literature of this period. You can see I bolded that phrase, limitations imposed upon man. Remember how the characters in realist fiction are able to act on their choices? We're going to see a difference here in naturalism. One of the sources for what's coming up here is a really great website by scholar Donna Campbell. I've given you the website here. So if you want to take a look at it, find more information about naturalism, there's the website. Okay, so style. The style tends to be very clinical and objective, very detached. There's not going to be a whole lot of involvement between the narrator or the author and what's being written about. It might be useful to know that the major figures in naturalism, Crane, Bierce, others, had a background in reporting and journalism, and so they seem to be transferring that same journalistic style to their fiction. I'm going to spend a couple of slides here on the themes that you'll see in naturalist fiction. The scholar Charles Child Walcott called it a chronicle of despair. That sounds uplifting, right? Violence and survival. These characters often live in a violent world and they struggle to survive. Walcott also coined the phrase the brute within each of us. So the idea that within us are these warring passions of lust and greed and domination that the character has to fight to control, and not always successfully. Another major theme is the idea that the universe, that nature, are indifferent to us. Back before the Civil War, the Romantics like Emerson liked to write about taking a walk in the woods and how that would uplift us and the currents of God would flow through nature and through us and all those lovely things. If you've read Wordsworth's poetry, you get sort of the same idea. This is very different in naturalists. Look at this poem that's assigned for this week. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist. However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." By Stephen Crane. That's pretty dark, right? At best, nature and the universe don't really care about you. But at worst, they can be really dark forces that you have to battle. Think about, you might have read the short story by Jack London featuring the protagonist in this very cold, snowy climate. Nature is not his friend. It's, if anything, an adversary. Other themes in naturalist writing. A big one is that the characters are controlled by external forces. So instead of being able to act on their own choices, there are these external forces that act on them. One of them is the environment. Another is heredity. At worst, this can be kind of racist, but the idea that we are destined to be who we are because of our heredity. One example is the novel McTeague by Frank Norris, which featured an Irish protagonist. And you can probably imagine the worst stereotypes of Irish people, they all apply to McTeague. So this is sort of a dark side of naturalism. Instinct. Characters' instincts, back to that brute within. Characters act on instinct, not necessarily because they're reasoning things out. And then finally, just plain chance, dumb luck. If characters in regular realist fiction have a choice, these characters often don't. Here's a painting by the American artist Winslow Homer that I think nicely illustrates naturalist ideas. This painting is from 1885, just a touch earlier than the 1890s when most of naturalist literature was written. But you can see this is not really a soothing picture of the ocean. This is not like your vacation cruise. This depicts nature as a dark force, and the fisherman looks maybe a little trepidatious, a little concerned about what he could be in for here. The characters in naturalist literature, as I've suggested, are typically controlled by heredity, by instinct, and their attempts to exercise free will are typically hampered by these forces. The characters are often, though not always, lower class. The French writer Émile Zola describe them as human beasts. Again, not a very uplifting way to think about people. Nevertheless, these characters had some sort of compensating human value, as Pizer pointed out. In other words, they're not completely unlikable. We root for them. We want them to succeed. We like them. But nevertheless, these forces tend to overwhelm them. The key figures in naturalism are Ambrose Bierce, who wrote the story Chickamauga that we'll be discussing this week, Stephen Crane, the author of the poem we just looked at, and Jack London, whose work we're not reading this summer. All right, so in your reading guide, you have a little chart that looks like this. The idea is that you can compare on the left-hand side the major movements. Again, Romanticism comes before the timeline of our class. I just want you to have a sense of it so that you understand how realism is different. And I'd like you to see if you can figure out this chart. Maybe you can pause this video for a minute and see how you do figuring out this chart, because in a second here I'm going to advance it and show you what it might look like if it were completed. Okay, so if we compare Romanticism, for example, perceives individuals as godlike, idealized, the ideal romantic hero, whereas realism sees the individual as simply a person with the ability to act and make choices, and naturalism sees that individual as helpless, controlled by larger forces, oftentimes. Again, these are a lot of big generalizations. There are variations within these movements, obviously, but we're looking at some larger patterns here. Romantics will have characters that are unusual. But in realism, we see ordinary middle-class characters, agents of change, meaning again that they can act. And we see in naturalism characters that are lower class, ordinary, but also acted upon. In settings, oh, forgive my typo here, we see remote, sometimes exotic settings. In realism, though, the settings become ordinary. Same in naturalism. Sometimes we see more urban settings in naturalism, although that doesn't really fit with what we're reading this week. The plots and subjects in realism and naturalism both tend to be ordinary. We get ordinary vernacular style in realism with a more slightly more clinical and objective style in naturalism. I hope this chart helps you sort of visualize some of the differences between these movements. Okay, so let's move on to the reading for this week. Under the umbrella of psychological realism, you'll be reading Daisy Miller, A Study. This is a novella, a short novel, and that's where you'll be spending most of your time this week. There are a lot of detailed questions about Daisy Miller in the reading guide, so I hope that you'll use those. And you'll also be reading The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. You may have read that in high school. It's a really amazing story. Make sure that you pay careful attention to what's happening to this unnamed narrator. And then in naturalism, The Open Boat by Stephen Crane I have made optional simply because I'm trying to think about your time constraints this week. If you have a chance to read it, please do, even if you have a chance to skim it. It depicts 4 men who are trying to save their own lives after a shipwreck. They're in a small boat after their ship has wrecked, and they're trying to get safely to shore. And as you might imagine, the ocean is not necessarily cradling them and nurturing them. Focus on, instead, the very short stories, Chickamauga, Desiree's Baby, and Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, and then the poems by Crane. There are 2 of them, and one of them we looked at in this presentation. So that's it. As you go forward, use the reading guide. Ask questions if you have them. Make sure you use the discussion board to ask questions, because the chances are good that if you have questions, a classmate might have the same one. And finally, enjoy the reading. I'll see you in the discussions.